Hi everyone, welcome back to Side 9. I'm Reala.
And I'm Fulminatus. It's a very interesting release day with Set 3 Steel Requiem being arguably the strongest individual expansion this game has seen thus far.
With each new release, we get more work cut out for us. Considering this is an ever-expanding game with continued support reaching back to the first starter decks, we're excited to talk about entirely new strategies and some spicy generics that make more decks and brews possible.
Yeah, lots of work, but Mama didn't raise no quitter. We're mixing up the format from our last two booster videos. We'll talk about our overall thoughts on Set 3 from our testing so far, a quick blurb about what's not in this video, and then hop to the lightning round where we give you small snapshots of decks we won't go into full detail on, but it still feels right to have them featured in the video.
So if you're excited about how the Gundam Card Game is going to shake out in 2026, and you'd like to see more Side 9 throughout this year, please let us know by giving us a like and subscribe, and also as a nod to our favorite little workhorses, tell us in the comments what your favorite grunt suit is. I'm a fan of the Strike Dagger.
Not so fast, Reala. We have more exciting news for the people who'd like to support the channel. We're finally enabling channel memberships. We've had the ability for a little while, but it never quite felt like the right time. But with what we have planned for the channel this year, it seems like the best time to enable those who'd like to show a little extra support. So if you'd like your name featured as a supporter in the credits of future videos, feel free to join as a member.
The third booster for the Gundam Card Game is absolutely explosive. Card quality seems very high, individual LRs are either solid generics or create new brews on their own, and otherwise non-complete or meta-relevant strategies are getting a lot of new tools.
Not to mention, we're getting some much needed interaction that seems really solid. Hopefully more options at action timing help shake up gameplay and give some of the longtime trading card gamers a treat to be able to make more plays in reaction to their opponents.
But I think that's a good enough blurb for now. We figure it would be better to just show you what's up. With the ever-expanding card pool, it is no longer realistic to go over literally everything. So let's first give a little aside on what we're not talking about. Not enough density of good cards to consider this a relevant archetype deck, Union Flag custom aside.
The Vulture's archetype has plenty of trash synergy, but right now it's lacking good payoffs. X's Anthem is good and Suppress is powerful, but it doesn't justify how the majority of the archetype is below rate. However, a synergy piece or two could salvage this archetype.
It was cool to see new UNE continue to get some fun tools this set, but making rested 1 HP tokens is a fundamental problem of the deck that'll either need targeted support or a lot of ping cards to sunset for this archetype to finally shine.
What is there to say? It's green-white wing, just with some new toys in Altron and Freedom. The new Freedom has an advantage in the mirror in that it effectively trades in its weight class and helps to insulate against getting blown out by other control threats. However, it's still competing in its space for Ailstrike, so we're running a 3-1 split between the two. Altron justifies more Wu-Fei and is a strong play in mirrors or against red-white blockers. However, most of the time you're likely to slam Wing 0 if you're deciding between the two.
Yippee! Clan finally got its 2-1-2-2. Will this break it into meta dominance? No. However, the sheer quality of life of Game Vanilla can't be understated. It allows you to make your synergy curve start right from the first unit you play. It also means LR Red Gundam can make your 2-2 a 4-2, and that's a relevant line for trading.
Pretty much the only change to this deck is the new Kshatriya replacing a Showa Resolve. It's another body, it has decent value, it still represents the same relative card advantage, and is another Charzaku 2-hit.
What if we got an Anksha that helped enable the card to draw off a Gundam Barbatos first form? While Gundam Barbatos Adapt is a slightly different stat spread at 2 AP and 4 HP, we are getting a sweet self-ping to facilitate our first form, something we used to have to fully rely on Mikazuki Link to achieve. This is a standard blue-purple aggro deck in spite of this new addition though. Play low to the ground, develop an overwhelming board state, and high roll with an RX-70 Link on curve to seize victory.
While this deck has shown promise last meta, and will probably continue to in this meta as the new G-Quux is quite good, it's been relegating to the lightning round as the deck is super flexible, running basically its entire level range in red and white. You can run small red, big white, blocker focus, ping focus, or something like what's on screen. Red's big threats continue to be hilariously intimidating, and like I previously said, the new Freedom's biggest upside is forcing other control decks to deal with it while your top end continues threatening their shields.
Well, it's a list. Ayuka is potentially still struggling this meta. However, they did get a new tool in Zeta Gundam Biosensor. It isn't difficult to get plenty of AU units in the trash by level 7, creating a dynamic where a Zeta play the previous turn can eat a powerful enemy unit for free. The new freedom allows you to continue controlling the top end while you selectively use your bases to enable Zeta Gundams since your high level units aren't blockers.
A few new toys for the blue-white blockers build from last meta. While we've gone with the Epion variant, these same benefits can be found in the Seed variant as well. The Gustav Karl adds a blocker whose stats trump Lifrith and Ricky Dicky while conditional. A Healthy Curiosity is less strict card advantage than Resolve, however, it's a third of the cost and fits better into the curve plays the deck commits to. But the real new treat to the deck is the Devour base. Healing your blockers or an Epion turns into huge value. Alright, let's get to talking about some of our new brews for set 3 that we're really excited to talk about. And as always, it's the best place to start with new archetypes. So I know he's been putting in plenty of testing, so we're going to start with something that most people are probably pretty excited for in Celestial Being.
Yes, this is definitely like a flagship, I think, starter deck product, starter deck 7. Lots of players are really excited for this one going into both that starter deck release and now further supported in this booster. But, you know, let's just go over the obvious stuff. You know, very first and foremost, just kind of the front runners of the deck in my mind is the Gundam Curios link, which happens at level 3 if you're able to get all the pieces, and then of course the Dynamis link that happens at level 4 if you get all those pieces. These allow you to do really potent and early board trade like tricks, I guess is the best way of putting it, to where your card is living and basically taking no damage in the process, and your opponent's cards are gone like the wind. And of course, as we know in Gundam Card Game, that's really powerful if you're basically untapping with anything, if you're reactivating your units to basically go wherever you want with. The world's kind of your oyster at that point onward. Of course, the deck, you know, is trying to climb up in levels as most Gundam Card Game decks are doing. I guess all of them at this point, right? So like we have a bridge to this kind of early game that plays, you know, some modest vanillas and that really powerful board clearing stuff, and then we're moving onward to more combo specific plays. So for example, I like talking about the Gundam starter deck Exia. You know, as we covered in the starter deck video, very self-fulfilling machine, compare with anything, gets you some cantrips, gets you the ability to reactivate a resource if you really need it. And in this case, the card that we are using to be able to make the most advantage out of that resource is a card called Look of Determination. All right, so this card is a level 2 cost that has action timing. The action timing is to choose an active enemy unit that is level 2 or lower, and you destroy it. And then if you have 10 or more cards in your trash, regardless of what archetype or anything, you get to choose an active enemy unit that is level 4 or lower instead. So of course, this kind of feeds into that whole entire Exia loop that we've been talking about. We mill a couple cards, we draw a card if we mill a CB. Look of Determination, of course, as we know in Gundam Card Game, all tokens that the opponent is going to be able to spawn, we can kill those on the spot, not really have to worry about it, and kind of move on. So we're talking about basically anything Corsica base makes or anything Striker Pack makes, obviously. It's, you know, one of the reasons why I say this light type gun cannon was so good previously, but this has even more range of what it can be killing because it's not just tokens. It just so happens that tokens are the easiest thing that this can kill. And so yeah, it gives this deck a little bit of interaction, a little bit of fun, you know, board, you know, tempo plays that we're trying to just overwhelm the opponent.
It's also really good because it, of course, targets things like Lifrith and Rick Diaz, things that we were largely using Fatal Strike to deal with in the past, but this extends the range as we get later in the game. You know, I can't tell you how many times we've been playing against blue on an RX-78 or literally any of Charzaku's, so the fact that this just kills that outright at action timing means it very easily can save you in the late game.
For sure, yeah. One thing that Fulm has been saying a couple times during testing as well, which is really funny, is that level targeted removal is so much better than AP or HP targeted removal, because exactly, case in point, if the opponent has that RX-78 that's level 4 that's linked even, this card covers that range as well. But of course, we'd be amiss if we didn't talk about what this deck is actually trying to be doing late game. So let's go ahead and take a look at our Gundam Exia Trans Am. This is the CB specific kind of late game option. Obviously has natural suppression, so that's super good to start going for those shields late game. Obviously we talked about going for board clearing in the early game, so having something that allows us to kind of catch up on shields or kind of make the shield parity a little bit more between you and your opponent is really good, but also has this really powerful effect that requires 10 or more CB cards in your trash that then gives you the ability to kill an enemy unit with the lowest HP. And so this is one of those cards that, CB doesn't have the best scaling game. We actually have another level 8 cost card that we see in the screen right now that you may have recognized very well for any longtime Gundam Card Game players here. But Exia is really just going in for more board clearing and, again, just going for the dome. Let's talk about, again, that elephant that is really just sticking out on this deck, the Wing Gundam Zero.
Address me.
Yeah, address me. As we know, Wing Gundam Zero on a base rate is probably the strongest card in this entire game. And when we have the ability to board clear as well, we have to think about kind of the interaction and what your opponent is going to be doing versus each of these boss monsters, both Trans Am and Wing. So if we're playing Gundam Exia Trans Am, that's going to be killing when it connects. So the opponent's first natural response to that is going to be wanting to play as many cards from their hand onto the table as possible. So like we're playing all those 2 cost, 1 cost that have been run in the hand throughout the game, just so they can sneak in.
Yeah, if you can't block Exia, then the real play against it is to just put your low end on the board so that they can take the hit when Exia collides with shields.
And so if they go in with all those cards, they lay their hand on the table, you can then kind of have like that ace up your sleeve. And honestly, maybe not even that expected this early in the format. The deck may settle having Wing Zero and people just expect this deck to have Wing Zero. But definitely in the early format, it's not on the top priority of the opponent's mind that the opponent is going to be teching in a G-Team card, right? to be able to top end the CB deck. So to me, we think that those 2 cards just like play together hand in hand perfectly to seal the deal if the game has not already been sealed already.
Yeah, and so the other advantage there is, we talk about how Wing Zero punishes dropping all your small units to insulate against Trans Am. However, Trans Am also punishes the usual play against Zero by being like, hey, I'm only going to develop 1 to 2 high quality units, things that live through the board wipe or aren't targeted by it because they're over level 5. And so Trans Am then punishes that by immediately blowing those units out by connecting with shields.
Right. And so, yeah, we've spent the past, however much amount of time kind of gassing this deck up. But of course, we always like to talk about, the Achilles heel of any particular strategy. And so this deck kind of has a big case of sometimes quote unquote losing to itself. Obviously, I talk about the Kyrios and Dynamis links very, very favorably, but the question on a lot of people's minds is, well, what happens if you just don't see that specific pilot? Well, it turns out these cards are not super geared towards being good vanillas on base rate. We made the comparison from Dynamis to the original starter deck RX-78 in our starter video and still are making that comparison. However, where they become less comparable is when we are fielding a vanilla RX-78 and a vanilla Dynamis. Vanilla meaning, I guess, unpaired or unlinked in this case. And so that's kind of where the deck flounders. Trans Am is really doing a good job at capitalizing on kind of widening that advantage when you have had that advantage early in the game. But if you're just like dropping like Kyrios is vanilla and Dynamis is vanilla, and you're expecting Trans Am to really be doing significant heavy lifting for you towards the end of the game, I think that you'd be sorely mistaken in exactly how much Trans Am can actually do. Like, you need to have set up an advantage earlier in the game for Trans Am to actually do what it wants to do. And so I think that's like the biggest problem with this deck right now. But other than that, I've been having a fun time testing this one. And yeah, it seems like people are pretty on the money in the fact that CB seems to be a, if not a meta contender, a solid contender in this upcoming format. One thing that's been really, really fun seeing in Gundam Card Game thus far is just seeing all of these blue cards with Repair. Repair is a really, really good keyword. It helps you, again, set up those favorable trades and start going to face after you do those favorable trades as kind of the name of the game so far and what has been happening in the game thus far. So what if we had a whole entire deck that just like synergized around that? This is the O. Fulm. Let's talk about this list.
So one thing that's pretty notable about this list, this is potentially not the list's final form. I feel like there are a lot of aspects of this deck that can be adjusted to taste or adjusted based on how the meta shakes out, and that's one of the things that's really cool about it, is in its base form, this is a mono blue deck. So that means at any point that individual pieces of this deck don't perform, they can be replaced with either different blue cards or cards of an entirely different color. The core, though, is extremely solid. It turns out that Repair is one of the best keywords in this game and consistently just recurs value. And so having an archetype largely based around synergizing with Repair is just mwah, chef's kiss.
For sure. I definitely like all of your cards feeling like so sticky. It's like everything has like a tape of adhesive and it's just like, nope, you're not putting this thing off the board unless you really, really give me a concerted effort to do it. And yeah, Repair is definitely that first step in what's making these cards just stick around to give you what is potentially infinite value over the course of the game when you think about it. Because if a card never dies, it's sticking there forever, right?
If it destroys one other card and then doesn't die until the end of the game. That's technically infinite value.
Yep, very, very technically.
But the other thing that's really fun is from set 1 to now, we have kind of gotten a high value repair unit at every step of the level curve. There are a handful of cards here that kind of step down. Misala's in May mode might be a little sketchy because it turns out having repair 1 on 2 HP is a hard sell. There are very few things in this game that only deal 1 damage.
Say hello 1/1 Zaku token or something.
Yeah, but it does mean that, like for example, it can live through 1 wave of Kshatriya if they don't follow anything up. So sometimes it's relevant, but it's largely here because it does have repair, so it synergizes with other cards later on in the deck, and it has the very valuable Jupitrus trait. So a huge part of the way this deck works, we've been talking about value, but really what it wants to do is it creates sticky bore states, and then at the top end, we'll start with the big man himself, the O, the level 7 5 cost 5/5, who himself has a very hefty repair 3, but the real jewel in its crown is that when it's paired, and of course we have his Link pilot here, but when it's paired, when another unit with repair attacks, you can choose one of your opponent's unit whose level is equal or lower and rest it. So that means that your big boys tamp down their big boys and you start swinging down the line. You can very easily clear boards once it's set up.
For sure. And one thing that's like really, really hilarious as well in the process is just kind of seeing that conga line of all of your big stuff being able to kill without any problem the opponent's smaller things to the board. And normally that would create sort of a disparity where it's like, okay, well, my things do live, but they have damage on them. No, but you have repair here, right? So it's kind of like you can do that whole entire conga line with the O, kind of smash all their small things, their small vanillas or their Rezels or, what have you, right? But at the end of the day, your things are repairing again to get another crack at it. So this is definitely like a late game sort of deck. And in testing, we also found that we are completely okay just kind of parallel playing with the opponent where it's like, I play a guy, you play a guy, I play a guy, you play a guy. Because at the end of the day, as long as time is progressing within the game, we are a heavier deck than most decks in the game right now. And we're confident that we're going to be able to turn that corner and make sure that we're doing those trades so we can finally swing to the dome.
Yeah, and then, of course, it would behoove us to talk about Paptimus Sirocco himself. So he's level 5, 1 cost 2/2, so he has that Benager / full frontal stat line. I guess technically full frontal's level 6, but we're still getting our +2/+2. But his wind linked ability is actually deceptively powerful. Obviously, effects that let us draw are good effects, but giving another one of our units that generally tend to have a decent body attached to them an additional repair 2 lets them take very greedy trades and basically go unpunished because they'll just heal back to full at the end of the turn. So we get our card back, we put our opponent down a card, and we do it without really making anything that vulnerable.
Right, this pilot here is just everything I think you would ever want on a pilot, right? It gives you a higher stat line than most pilots in the game. It gives you your card back. It has additional text, narrowly on Jupitrus, but thankfully a lot of this deck is Jupitrus, right? This pilot, I think, is just in the running for, potentially one of the best pilots in the game, especially when in archetype, right? Like, obviously, you wouldn't be chucking this in just anything, but in this archetype is very, very serviceable.
I think best pilot in the game is a bold claim, because we're still in the land of competing with pilots like Amuro and Kira, but definitely within his archetype. Like, he is a huge part of what pushes the deck forward, and of course, being able to link our Jupitrus units and our O, that's really what brings power to the table here, because once you turn the corner with this deck, being able to slam your opponent, link your units, get things going sideways, especially because you'll start getting in those simplified game states where your opponent will play 2-3 units pass, and the O lets you just tamp them down and get rid of them before your opponent gets value out of them. And of course, this all dovetails super nicely with the fact that, as everybody who's played against an aggro player in this game is aware, Blue has a very, very solid core of generic cards. We've got our RX-78, we've got our Alex, we've got our Amuro Ray.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're starting to mention those now. I was going to go into them as well. Obviously, RX-78 Amuro requires no introduction, right? But it is a important point as well when talking about this deck, when an archetype is able to just slide in kind of the greatest hits of their color's identity, right? Such as those cards. And of course, we got kind of a newcomer on the block as well. We have this full armor Unicorn Gundam Destroy mode, and I know that in testing you told me that there's a very, very specific reason that you have this in the deck. So would you mind sharing with the audience what What's going on with that?
So full armor serves a very specific purpose, and there's a reason he's here at 2 copies. And that is he being a level 8, 6/6 with repair 3. He has a monstrous stat line, a great body. He's not relying on being piloted, but the primary reason he's here is that he contests everyone else's big units. You know, people playing the new generic G-Quux, people playing Wing Zero. This is the card that lets you get in on those cards because a linked O beats an unlinked Wing Zero. However, how does he hit it if they just played it last turn? Well, your full armor unicorn can turn it sideways and then the O can take it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very specific. And of course, in those late game scenarios, even if you aren't necessarily up against a big unit on the opponent's side, it can definitely seal the deal versus those little more weenie cards on the other side of the table, because repair 3 is a big repair number. And again, just kind of going full circle on just the sticky nature of this archetype in the first place.
And then another card that I actually really wanted to point out, because I feel like this is one of those new generics that people aren't really talking about because it's not that flashy and it's not super powerful, but what it does do is it just plugs holes. The new Kshatriya is such a good unit with its 4/4 stat line, repair 1 and draw 1 when you play it. It's just one of those cards that just plugs a lot of holes in blue. Like, I think generally any unit focus build, if you're playing stuff like the new Curiosity card or playing a Show of Resolve, you could potentially just replace those 1-to-1 with this.
Right, and so far, you know, one thing that may kind of stand out as a potential missing card in this deck list is just any number of a Show of Resolve, which of course has been a very, very powerful card all the way from beta up until now. But I think that Kshatriya alongside our pilot here giving us a card just gives us just enough incidental card draw to feel like we're comfortable without having to cash in the Show of Resolve and just being able to play curve and just be resource efficient every single turn. You know, of course, a Show of Resolve is definitely card economy efficient, but it's not resource efficient. You'd rather be developing the board and playing tempo and things like that. So if a deck can just have those few little hidden pieces of card draw, it goes a very long way.
But having said all that, the deck definitely has its struggles. Now, it is surprisingly robust in the fact that it doesn't consistently lose on the low end or consistently lose on the top end. However, it absolutely requires you to actively manage your resources and actively protect where your value is coming from. So this means that you have to be very intelligent with your masalas to not give up an O for free. And of course, if we run into the situation of you just don't see any of your pilots, you draw your cards in the wrong order, the deck absolutely falls apart, and it is quite difficult at regaining advantage on a large gap. Like if you fall too far behind, you potentially it's going to take you too long to get back into the game, so you're just going to start behind and continue falling behind as the game goes on.
For sure. I think that sometimes that's them breaks on these archetypes in Gundam that try to go a little bit more heavy with their costs and levels. An aggro deck is always going to be able to play its like cost 1, 2, and 3 cards, right? In basically any order that they want them to. And this deck is a little bit more strict, or any deck with a high level cost curve is a little bit more strict on the points in the game at which they're allowed to play their cards, right? So that's, of course, kind of just comes with the territory, right?
Aggro in and of itself is a huge part of the reason that you see the return of our good friend Gun Cannon.
Welcome back, Gun Cannon.
With all of that said, though, I have been extremely pleased with how this deck has performed. We like gassing up new decks here, but I say without any exaggeration, spin, or hyperbole, I actually do think this is a perfectly competitive deck, and at the very least, it is very in line with the 1-year war and green-white wing of yestermeta.
Yeah, and so awesome too for it to kind of enter into the meta, if it were. Of course, we're not, saying this is a true prediction of the meta, but, it's good to have a little bit of variety in with the top decks in the game. So if this kind of rises to the challenge and is able to take up one of those slots in the meta, it is a welcome addition for sure to have kind of a slow going board based control deck.
And with that, let's get into a deck that Reala's been trying to make work since set 1. It is time to commit once again to the Athrons and the Duel Gundams in Zaft.
So I will say that this is looking better than it has historically. However, that does not necessarily mean it is looking super, super great. So let's go over this deck real quick, just kind of at a high level. At first glance at this deck list, you're probably going to be noticing that there's a lot in common with just a standard red-white control or red-white ping or whatever you want to call it. Except you take some of those red-white ping specific generic cards and you turn them into Zaft's energy. So of course we have, our suite of blockers, and of course we now have Reala and Red, so of course we're very happy to kind of cash that in. But outside of that, we're dealing with our Aegis Gundam my main mode, which, has been with us since the starter decks. Very popular card, has grown in popularity ever since, of course, Dandy and Simon's win in 4th place finish over at the Orlando Regional. All the reasons why that card and Link combo was good in that regional is going to be reasons why this card is still good in the current meta. Being able to attack an active enemy unit and then dealing breach damage in the process is certainly no joke. But of course, we do have some new cards that are added into the mix that I think we should talk about. I think the real elephant in the room, and the one that really kind of brings this deck together, the reason why we want to actually be splashing Zaft into our deck rather than just playing that traditional red-white deck, as mentioned before, is a new LR called Providence Gundam. So Providence Gundam is kind of like better Quibbly, I think is the best way to put it. It is a little bit more focused into Zaft, so it gives an anthem of AP +2 to all your Zaft cards if you are paired with a Zaft pilot. And then also on attack, you get to ping an enemy unit for 1 damage for each 4 AP that this unit has. So typically you're dealing with, around at least 8 AP. Sometimes you're able to really stretch that into 12. That's kind of the higher end of Providence Gundam. But yes, definitely a very scary ping threshold, especially if you're able to link it on the turn. And so far, you just kind of control the board from that point of the game onward.
Now, when you say we're comparing it to Quibbly, you specifically mean in the ping regard, right? We aren't trying to portray this as on the same level as getting suppression 2 for a turn.
For sure, yes. Definitely on the ping regard. That suppression is definitely kind of unmatched. But, if you get the requirements of Providence Gundam and you have more AP, you're typically getting more than the ping that Quibbly gets you. And that's kind of the ceiling of Providence Gundam for sure. One thing I think is important to note about this deck, like a particular strong suit, I think is just the base recycling that you get. So of course we're on a 5 base split. We got Vesalius. We also got Yakindu, which is a new Zaft base that gives you +3 AP on one of your friendly Zaft units the turn is played, so definitely can help you a lot in terms of, putting Providence Gundam over the line on a particular ping threshold, right? But Rao, the new Link, or the new pilot for this deck, allows you to salvage a Zaft base card from your trash. And so what actually ends up happening in a lot of games is that you are playing on average 1 more base per game than a lot of other decks in the field. And so that can buy you some time to maybe play your second Providence Gundam, which at that point, if you have the second Providence Gundam, you're most likely going to be winning that game. And so that extra base play is, more often than not going to be that little bridging gap that actually gets you to your win condition of this deck.
Well, also something that really came up in testing and is going to eternally be my bane, especially between this and the new level 6 green bases, that even though these are level 6 bases, they're still 6 HP bases, so it doesn't matter if it's level 6 if you burst it out of shields.
Yeah, exactly. If you pop it out of shields, then you're winning. And let's talk about a couple things that can happen when you pop things out of shields. Thanks for the segue there, Fulm. I appreciate you. So of course we have Striker Pack. We know it. We love it. Gets you a free unit if you pop it in shields. Outside of that, you have a modal option to make another blocker. Very good stuff. And we're trying a couple copies of this new G-Fred that allows you to deploy a G-Fred token that's rested that has 4 AP and 3 HP. And you only get to do that if there are 3 of those enemy shields. And so, yes, it does require you to burst it. Yes, it does require you to have whittled away your opponent's shields over the course of the game. But if you get that in an opportune moment, that could be the one unit you need to kind of differentiate your deck from losing versus winning. So sometimes it's a nice little surprise to have that little variance pop out and help you win the game that way.
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting things in this game is a 4-3 isn't that big of a deal. However, a free 4-3 is suddenly a very big deal.
Yeah, it turns out getting things for 0 is good in card games. More news at 11, right? A couple other, I guess, honorable mentions here. We've kind of gone over the whole deck in depth and, hopefully have illustrated the deck's overall attempted strategy, right? But we also have Guai's Commander type, which is another card that helps push Providence Gundam over the line. So it has support 1, but then also has the ability that when it's arrested by an effect, which, who would have thunk it, support is an effect, you get to give something an additional +2 AP during that turn. And so another way for Providence Gundam to really get out there and, kind of show its best self. And then finally, this last card is really interesting. I wouldn't even call it a tech. I think this is a core part of the strategy at this point. Dual Gundam Assault Shroud, the new one, not to be confused with the old LR Dual Gundam Assault Shroud, which is also a fine card, I suppose. It just didn't make it into this list. And it says, when it has 5 more AP, you can choose an active enemy unit that has level 5 or lower as its attack target. So very Atherin coded. You're very familiar familiar with that kind of line of text. And Providence Gundam sets that card up for you, so it's kind of it's a 2-card combo, but very, very easily fulfilled a 2-card combo, and from that point you can continue to board control, which is what Providence Gundam wants to be doing anyway with the pings. So yeah, overall, this deck is improved, like I said at the start of the section. I will say, out of all the decks in this video, this is probably the one I'm least confident in, mainly just because it's hard from an opportunity cost perspective to justify playing this over just a traditional red-white control deck, because as we mentioned in this section, Quibbly having suppression is no joke, and Providence Gundam not having it is a little bit sad. I wish, Providence Gundam is an incredible card, but like, can you imagine how overspec it would be if it had suppression? Like, come on now. But that's kind of where I'm feeling on this Zaft brew.
I mean, it is worth noting, we're trying to force the Zaft Tribal here, but we would be perfectly unsurprised by Providence Gundam finding a home in a classic red-white deck and basically just cutting it down to Reala, Providence Gundam, and a couple Zaft bases, right?
Yes, that's a very important aspect to note. We can definitely make this a lean engine if we wanted to, and that's actually funny considering that I feel like I made this engine relatively lean. Of course, we have, the links and the commander types and assault shot and things like that. But we could go even leaner with this package, which I think is one of its strengths for sure.
An LR just pinging for 2 on swing may just be good enough, especially since the pilot essentially generates 1 in card advantage for you.
So while Zaft may not have been very present in the previous metagame, I can assure you there's one thing that has been very, very present, and that is the blocker keyword in Gundam Card Game. A lot of us remember the old Shenlong Gundam from set 1 being a good blocker hate card, and so Fulm, what's going on here with set 3? Do we have more blocker hate cards to really just kind of see the field and be able to hate people out of the game?
Oh boy, we do. Now, I'm sure most people are familiar with Altron Gundam being a new tool piece for the classic green-white builds that are going to Wing Zero. However, my bold claim here is I think over time, those decks are going to actually see a lot less Altron play, largely just because if I'm deciding between playing Altron or Wing Zero in this deck, I'm almost always slamming Wing Zero. However, if you specifically hate the local white player, you can absolutely field a deck that is going to just blow him out of the game in value, because good lord does Altron hate blockers.
For sure. It's always so funny seeing these very targeted, specific hate cards, just not even in Gundam in general, just in any card game, because some guy just like really doesn't want to see specific things sitting across the other table from them. So this is a deck that definitely seems to just be really preying on the fact that we are assuming that the opponent is going to be having some amount of blockers in some capacity. Of course, it's getting a little bit easier because, other colored blockers are being considered, not necessarily like a mainstay part of Gundam Card Game meta, but this is a deck that could continue to have relevancy further down the line as other colors maybe get cheap blockers to just kind of get hated out of the game with Shenlong. But
they don't even necessarily need to be cheap blockers. I mean, with the O entering the meta, Altron is just as happy to blow up a Masala.
Right, for sure. Yeah, less so in the case of Altron, but I guess more so in the case of Shenlong Gundam. So Fulm, tell me a little bit just about, because of course we're talking about the blocker hate, but at a high level, what is this deck trying to do basically at all stages in the game?
So I'm sure everybody is familiar with about half of this deck. We see our gun tank, we see our Rezel, we see our Anksha, we see our RX-78, and largely what Alex or Gundam NT1 is going to wind up being is another copy of RX-78. We have the standard blue tempo beatdown package. Everybody knows what this does, everybody knows how this works, but we're complementing this with various Shenlong links, essentially to punish our opponent for trying to stop that initial game plan. Of course, it also helps that Wu Fei himself is really good at challenging early low-end boards. If we have less than 3 AP and he is sitting in any flavor of Wu Fei Gundam, Shenlong, or Altron, he's not taking damage.
Yes, and this kind of highlights a key point that I really liked about the old Shenlong decks in the previous format. Of course, those didn't really crack into the meta. They were probably considered like anti-meta rogue, however you want to categorize them. However, as you pointed out, you're doing the regular blue aggro shell to an extent, But then also, if the opponent's trying to stop you, then you have then breach cards to capitalize on the fact that the opponent is turning their card sideways to deal with your sideways cards. And so you're not really halting your tempo in order to progress your game state. And so that's, of course, true of both Shenlong Gundams, having that breach there. And of course, you know, Lord forbid, if you get to level 8 and you have that link ready, then that's like truly the closer of the game when you get to play Altron.
Absolutely. And then the other important thing, and I'm sure a few people have noticed the NT1 full armor and Christina McKenzie here. Those are largely insulating plays for when you're going second or you're slightly down and you really need to advance your curve. It doesn't read as good on first glance, but Christina allowing you to up tempo, not giving up your EX resource, or just being able to squeak in a link under any other kind of constraint. You know, on turn 4 you get out a full armor link and you drop a Rezel or you play an Anksha. It really does create an environment where this deck seeks to get ahead on tempo and then essentially just breach its way through to kill your opponent.
It definitely seems like a case of Christina being greater than the sum of her parts overall, just because it facilitates that Alex link for 0, and then of course because we have full armor in the deck, sometimes you can just do that thing where you go under the opponent and have that one last link for game, and that's getting more and more important to have, especially in a game that is, you know, more of a beatdown style deck that's trying to really fit in that last couple of shields.
Yeah, it's something that feels absolutely fantastic in this deck is having the Christina and that Alex on your turn 5 when you're going second, so you can immediately link it without cashing in that EX resource, so you can hold on to it to hit level 8 a turn earlier to actually get into Altron, essentially on curve as the second turn player.
Yo, advanced strategies. You heard it here first, folks, at Side 9.
And then, of course, another large part of this is we're running a 2-2 split between Underground Desert Base and Peace Million. These can effectively be somewhat interchangeable in the fact that we can run less Peace Million and run more Underground Desert Base, because the only card that really has synergy here with Peace Million is Altron Gundam, but being able to heal your Altron is such an advantage, especially because the other two parts up top in this deck, between your RX-78 and your Alex, also both have repair too, so making your board a little bit stickier is really powerful. But like we said in the Zaft section, Peace Million being a burstable 6 HP base can absolutely just be backbreaking in and of itself.
Absolutely. And Fulm, I have to ask you, because we've been talking a lot about this deck in the context of, oh yeah, my opponent's going to have a bunch of blockers. I'm thinking about the red whites and the green white wings of the world, and I'm going, oh yes, this is going to be so great. I'm going to kill all their Rick Diaz's, I'm going to kill all their Lifriths. But like, how does this deck perform when it's sitting across from like, I don't know, One Year War, or like any other aggro deck in the game?
That very quickly becomes a hit your links scenario, because while the deck can compete due to how breach works and staying ahead on tempo, it's definitely much weaker against non-blocker heavy decks than it is against blocker heavy decks. And so that's just the exchange. It is absolutely a deck that you need to read the room and understand, like, if you're going to go an entire tournament day without seeing a blocker deck, maybe don't bring this deck.
Seems like an incredible case of feast or famine, in which case the feast being the blockers that the opponent decides to field, or it's famine if there's nothing to eat. So that's kind of how it goes with this deck.
Absolutely. Again, it really wants to prey on the blocker decks in the room, and that's just the fate of a hate deck. If the thing you're hating on isn't there, then you're having a rougher time.
Yeah, so I guess given that weakness of the deck, how confident are you saying that you are in the deck going?
It largely depends on how relevant blocker remains, obviously, but I would say as a baseline, I'm actually relatively comfortable and confident in this deck because white has been hilariously represented up to this point due to the prevalence of its blockers, and I don't see that changing in this meta.
Yeah, and then of course we could be in for a surprise. Maybe this meta is going to change quite a bit, but yeah, so for us over here at Side 9 are not really seeing blockers dying down anytime soon, or at least they won't like sunset, for lack of a better term. There's still going to be blockers in the meta.
And with that Shenlong list out of the way, it's time to talk about something that we here at Side 9 love, and that's about sacrificing things for power, which you can check out with our new purple list, and Reala will lead us off on that.
See, that's funnier than you would possibly even realize just looking at this deck for the first time, because I think we're making several sacrifices for power here. Of course, we have the traditional ping package that is happening with a lot of purple Tekkadan units, but also one thing that kind of rings true in my mind for this deck is just opportunity cost. I think the most important thing that we need to talk about first and foremost is just kind of the flagship card of the deck, Gundam Barbatos Lupus. So this is a 5 AP, 5 HP card that happens at level 7 and for only 6 cost. But at activate main speed, so this is not even once per turn, you can just do it as many times as you want, but you can choose 3 Tekkadan/Teiwaz cards from your trash to then remove them from the game, and then you can ping something for 2. And so that is really kind of the cornerstone of why this deck is built the way it is. If you did not know what Gundam Barbatos Lupus did before this deck, you can definitely be a little bit confused, have a little bit of a head scratcher why we're playing this, what just seems like a pile of cards. But once you know what it does, then the rest of the deck list is going to be making a lot more sense to you.
Yeah, it turns out that having everything be labeled Tekkadan or Teiwaz is incredibly important.
Right. And so early on, I'm not even going to lie, Fulm and I were talking about this deck, and we just really didn't know how, I guess, meta relevant or good this deck was actually going to be, because again, that opportunity cost framework that we're analyzing this deck from, well, if all of your cards or a large density of your cards have to be Tekkadan or Teiwaz trait, well, these cards have to be pretty good to prop up your game plan all the way up until level 7, when you can actually use your payoff card in Gundam Barbatos Lupus. I think the saving grace here, and kind of the sigh of relief for a lot of people that want to make this deck work, is that there is a decent density of good Tekkadan and Teiwaz cards. So let's just go over like a couple of them real quick. Obviously, we get our draws off our first form, which is good. We have Reala that can continue the pressure. We have a generic 2/1/2/2. So all that's good stuff, just kind of in the deck and plays that you can have. But also we're not missing out on a density of cards that ping as well. So we have, Gundam Gujin Rebake, pretty solid blocker, gives you pings. Mikazuki August links with a lot of cards in this deck. And something like Gundam Barbatos Adapt also contributes more to the ping overall in this deck as well. So you get to be pinging units off in a traditional red style deck earlier in the game before Lupus hits the field as well. So you're kind of just playing your cards, playing your units, progressing your game state, and doing a little bit of pings when it counts.
Yeah, I think another awesome thing when we're talking about this deck, because obviously Lupus itself is just very powerful. That's very apparent. The question was always just, does the deck enable it to excel as much as it should? And we come to find that, yeah, it really does, because a huge part of the advantage of Lupus is that it does have a quasi link haste in the fact that it's just an activate main. So with that, we're much less beholden to holding on to Mikazukis. We can just throw them for good trades. We can just let Barbatos Adapt roam free.
Right, and of course, I guess to highlight some of the weirder deck building choices here, because this, I've been highlighting that throughout the section, but this is not a traditional Gundam card game deck list, ladies and gentlemen. It looks really weird when you just lay it out, kind of like we have it in the video right now. But the idea is to just maximize the ratios of units, right? So like the only non-units we have are 4 base, because I think Fulm and I agree it's pretty non-negotiable. You need to have at least 4 base in the game so you just don't get your teeth kicked in by aggro. We're splashing white because we can have an extra color, and that helps fill the yard with more Tekkadan units, and they don't even have to hit the field to do that, so a good little bit of filter there. And of course, obviously we need the Mikazuki because it links with like 3 or 4 cards in this deck. So it's just the most obvious choice. And of course enables that really strong play pattern that you just highlighted just now.
To give a specific number, there are 5 total links for Mikazuki, even if we include the generic Tekkadan link.
Oh, true. Yeah, that's a good looking out on that one. So of course, let's talk a little bit about the weakness of the deck. We've been hyping up the ping potential and the haste potential of Mikazuki plus Lupus, all really strong play patterns. But of course, as has always been the issue with self ping and purple, if you play against red or maybe a ping centered, all the ping centered blue cards like Guntank and Anksha, sometimes you just like set up free trades for them, or like set up free exchanges for them to just like go in on your units. And that's never really a spot we want to be in. At least those cards are still going to trash, so you can maybe swing back with Gundam Barbatos Lupus when it finally hits the field. But obviously, giving the opponent free value with their pings is never a position you want your deck to be in. And unfortunately, this is a deck that's most susceptible to it.
Although I do want to take a moment and really key in on something that the deck has really performed well through testing and isn't immediately apparent. While obviously you'd never want to throw away cards for free, if your opponent is spending resources to get rid of your cards, you don't hurt anywhere near as badly as you would in other decks, because they do turn into fuel for Lupus.
For sure, yeah, and it's kind of that inevitability I think is the scariest part about this deck, and that's another thing in testing. we keep on looking at each other and we have like, sweat running down our brow and we just go like, well, okay, I'm playing against a Tekkadan deck. Level 7's coming up. It's very similar to the anticipation of waiting for the opponent to hit level 8 in wing decks, the white-green wing decks of previous format, and most likely in this format as well. Wing's not going anywhere, folks. But at this time, in this deck, the opponent hits there at level 7, and if there's enough density of Tekkadan, they could get a board clear that's almost as potent as a Wing Gundam Zero, so definitely very powerful and something to look out for in this upcoming meta. I'm fairly competent in this deck. Lupus is just such a powerhouse of a card, and of course the opportunity cost of running those Tekkadan units is not as high as we initially anticipated, so overall it's looking like this is a pretty solid package for a deck.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this deck is absolutely going to put up results, and it's really funny because we have transitioned to being pretty sure that this is a really good deck. We are not at all 100% on the build, though. We are really excited for people to create much more optimized builds of this.
It's kind of ironic that a archetype locked deck like Tekkadan and Tewa still has more, I guess, room to grow when it comes to deck building. Sometimes archetype specific stuff is not as restrictive in deck building as initially meets the eye. So I'm looking to see how people are going to take this deck and spin it, or even come up with their own, brew from the ground up. Looking forward to seeing how it's going. Some people say Christmas came early this year. I would argue that Christmas came early 11 months in advance this year, and arguably it may not even be a good Christmas gift, but let's talk about Cyclops for a little bit, Fulm. What have you been brewing?
So Cyclops is a really interesting archetype in the fact that it is once again another archetype that's relatively archetype locked, but it's also one of the first archetypes that we've really brought forward that is inexorably linked with another. All your Cyclops units are Zeon units, and while they all care specifically about being with other Cyclops units, your other Zeon cards are totally fine proccing off Cyclops units. And so it creates an interesting dynamic where there are quite a few little synergies that we can abuse, especially in green.
Yeah, definitely really interesting. Not even related to the Cyclops deck at first here, just kind of an aside. I do kind of like how we have a case of squares and rectangles when it comes to archetypes in this game now, where we have like Jupitrus and Titans and Cyclops and Zeon and things like that. I think there's a lot of cool design things or design directions that Bandai can go now that we know that this type of design space is in the game. But overall, when just taking a look at Cyclops as a whole, we are seeing some kind of heavy hitters from the old Zeon archetype as well, just kind of round out the deck. But of course, we got some new key cards as well, so I guess I'll lead you in, Fulm, and you can talk a little bit about, I'm sure you want to talk about Camphor amongst other things.
So Camphor is kind of what really sets up the mood for Cyclops, so to speak, in the fact that it is this honestly really cool, really aggressive card that allows you to take early aggressive trades with value units. And of course, when we're talking about Camphor, we should really talk about its pilot as well. And so we'll talk about Mikhail Kaminsky, who's a +2/+1, and then when the unit he's on attacks, he can give Breach 1 to any of your Cyclops unit. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the Camphor that he's in, but the fact that it is available to anything else, it's also not bound to link, so if he's on any of other Cyclops suits, we still get that benefit. But that ties in really well with what Camphor is doing, being a 4/3 body that when it's paired with a Cyclops pilot, all your Cyclops units can attack active units that are essentially smaller than them.
And at first glance, that seems just like so insane, right? Because it's kind of like you're turning all of your units into things with Amuro or Lock-On or insert good pilot here that allows you to do combat math, right?
It really comes into the fold with the token production that Cyclops brings to the table. Unfortunately, due to the relatively low quality of other Cyclops bodies, it oftentimes turns into a suicide mission for the rest of your Cyclops right. board. But we do have one mechanic to counteract this, and this is a card that I actually think is really cool and really exciting, even if it isn't the most powerful thing to be doing in the current meta, and that is Zakutu FZ, which creates 2 Add Balloon tokens, which are rested tokens that cannot be reactivated and cannot be piloted. They're 0/1s, so they are absolutely fodder. But while they're on the field, Zakutu FZ just can't take damage, period. So essentially, you have a quasi first strike. I mean, it's better than first strike because the opposing unit can't hit back on your turn, but it also means that they can't swing on their turn. They are forced to attack those tokens first.
Yeah, I will say, in this segment, I'm really channeling my inner Melvin here, but another design thing that I think is really, really fun in card games is just when the developers throw you a bone to set your opponent on like a little side quest. It's like, you know, it's like you're putting these tokens on the board and you're just like, haha, you have to deal with these, right? So there's always like a little bit of whimsy there when you, again, put your opponent on the side quest to actually actively progress in their game state. But of course, not to understate the power of that card as well. I'd venture to guess that this is probably one of the most powerful cards in the entire deck, and it's relatively innocuous too at a level 2/2 cost.
It synergizes extremely well with what I feel is a card that a lot of people are currently underrating, but will likely find more relevance, especially as the game ages, and that is specifically Over the River and Through the Woods. Now, obviously, this is a command pilot. It is otherwise a +1/+1 pilot, but that's not what makes it great. What makes it great is it is a command that deals damage equal to the number of tokens you control. So right now, Cyclops may struggle to generate a lot of tokens quickly. However, the exact moment that we get an archetype that's capable of slotting in green and makes a ton of tokens, this just can easily become like a 4 damage nuke to just drop for 1 at level 4.
And I'm willing to guess that you are not pairing this to much as a +1/+1 unless absolutely necessary, right?
Well, funnily enough, due to how another one of our pilots works, which is Bernard here, he requires having other pilots and commands from Cyclops Team in the yard to give +AP, capping out to a total of +4. So oftentimes you will just link a Cyclops unit using your command pilots.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of a happy accident how it works out like that. Outside of that, Fulm, I feel like there's some real elephants in the center aspect of this deck here. We haven't yet gone over G-Fred and H2 Normal. Can you kind of give us the rundown of why both of these are making the cut?
So we do have 2 LRs that are distinctly not Cyclops cards. So one thing that I really wanted to bring in this deck is we were talking about Zeon Synergy, and that really brings the Zaku 2 forward. You know, Char Zaku 2, Zeon staple, gets more Zeon cards, gets any of your Cyclops cards, but also gets the other cards of a secondary pack which we're running in the G-Fred package. Now, the G-Fred itself as an LR is a really interesting card. The first time anyone read this, we read that first line of pay 1, exile a pilot, deal 1 to all enemy units. That's an all-range attack on a body. Okay, I'm in. That's really good, right? But the immediate follow-up is, when linked, it can attack anything that has AP less than it does. And that wound up being way more relevant than the first effect, which is insane because we read that first effect, that's really good. But being able to create a 5/7 on turn 6 that is basically able to chew through just about anything that your opponent developed last turn. I mean, it goes straight through like an Ale Strike. Winds up being extremely relevant, and then it also has the 1 damage ping to the board. That is just an insane value package. And of course, Neon herself can just hit that Zeon card and get the free ping off of linking as well.
Yeah, it's just one of those cards that, and sometimes we talk about lean engines, I guess, in the context of Gundam Card Game, where you can just like distill things into kind of just its base form in terms of the package. We're already on a bunch of Zeon cards. It makes sense because G-Fred is a very powerful card, has a powerful link, has 2 extremely relevant abilities, so it kind of just becomes a, I guess, an inductive argument to where we just question ourselves and we're like, wait, why are we not playing this card in this shell? Instead of, you know, kind of the deductive argument that we typically go through when we like look through archetype specific pieces.
But of course, you know, if we're on LR G-Fred and we're on Neon anyway, then why not include the regular old common G-Fred? Now, this is a much worse card. We were talking about it earlier. However, when this card bursts, especially in an aggressive archetype, it can be absolutely backbreaking. But we also have some additional redundancy here in the fact that the worst case scenario on this card is we're linking it with a Neon and we're getting a 5/4 out of it. Like, that's still not a bad rate.
And of course, you know, Fulm and I come from a background of, you know, some high variance trading card games, so I love when they have that little extra layer, a little taste of added variance to really just capitalize throughout a game.
And then the final elephant in the room is, of course, Gundam Age 2 Normal. I think that this is a little underrated in the fact that this might become a borderline green staple. Being able to affect your opponent's combat choices is always powerful. I mean, that's a huge part of what props up blocker as a keyword, right? However, Age 2 Normal allows green to do this without dipping into other colors, and I think that that is extremely powerful, and all it costs you is just pairing a pilot to Age 2 Normal, so you wind up getting something that has an extremely relevant stat line, and it can immediately draw hate from something more valuable on your board, or it can be the thing that stops aggro from beating your face in. It's way more versatile than it initially reads.
And of course, I feel like this discussion is all coming full circle because that's another one of those little sub games that you make your opponent play. So yeah, super fun deck, very interesting play patterns. And oh yeah, I guess shout out to Zanzibar because we didn't mention it yet. But yeah, shout out to Zanzibar. We're forever going to force this base into our decks until it works. So there we go.
The deck wants to go up tempo, and Zanzibar's a great way to do that.
Yeah, time to play. Where's the Gelgoog though? We can't be doing that with the Gelgoog though. Do be doing that.
I will say that as excited as I am for this deck and as cool as I think this deck is, it still feels like it's missing a little bit of that je ne sais quoi. But I mean, we were talking that way about Age last format, and Age got a really powerful LR that really is like helping to bring the deck together. We might talk about that later, but it really feels like we're just one synergistic LR from everybody being like, okay, camp for something to be worried about. Alright, speaking of aggro decks, we've actually kind of been keeping this under wraps, but I think that this is the single deck that Reala is the most excited to talk about. Last meta, I tried really hard to get him onto blue-white aggro and kind of chickened out, sticking to his blue-purple, but this meta, he's committed.
Come on. We were here brewing the blue-white aggro deck together. I went to blue-purple just because I had more games on it for the Orlando Regional. Got a 6-3 finish, you know, obviously not the most accomplished feeling in the world, but also not the most defeated feeling in the world. But always, there's going to be that doubt in the back of my mind. What if I just played blue-white aggro? That day, I guess, ends today. That whole entire question ends today because I'm really, really loving this blue-white aggro deck. I'm not typically one that likes to show my bias, I guess, when it comes to making these videos, but I'm just going to say it right here. This is the deck I'm starting on this format. This is the deck that I have the most games on this format through our testing so far, and this is the deck that I'm going to see if I can continue to refine over the course of the meta because it is just looking so scrumptious. So
before we get into how it wins, I just have to cut in and I have to let everyone in the audience know, as somebody who is a playtesting partner to Reala, this is one of the most frustrating decks I have ever played against. It creates so many non-games.
It is kind of the high roll supreme, and you know, we can definitely get into that when it comes to the weakness section, but let's, you know, do what we typically do and just kind of highlight the best aspects of this deck. So elephant out of the room first, we are on the blue aggro shell. This should not be a surprise to anyone who is even moderately cued in to the metagame landscape of Gundam Card Game. Playing a bunch of 2/1/2/2s, we got the Amuro and RX-78 package, we have Corsica Pace, we have Rizel. These are all cards that don't really require that much introduction. One that might though, and one that's actually sparked a whole lot of rulings, controversies, and debate is Graham's Union Flag Custom. So let's go over this one in depth and we will give you kind of the correct reading of it. So this card is a level 4/3 cost with 4 AP and 2 HP. Naturally has high maneuver, so it gets around all of the white blockers, all the good purple blockers. I mean, God help someone if they're playing blue blockers, but it also does that. And it says, during Link, at the end of the turn when this unit is paired with a pilot, set as active. Okay, so that one's pretty intuitive to understand. It restands or reactives at the end of the turn that is paired to a pilot. Graham Acre is a level 4 1-cost pilot with the traditional plus 2 AP, 1 HP spread, and it says, during Link, when this rested unit, it says active by an effect, which is that aforementioned restanding ability of Union Flag Custom. You get to choose one enemy unit with 3 or less HP and return it to the owner's hand. So very importantly, due to the wording of the card, we are going to be able to restand this card once during the turn that it gets linked. And it turns out that that's actually more than enough for this card to put in so much tempo play and so much value over the course of a game.
Yeah, so looking at the list, there are immediate obvious parallels to 1 Year War.
Yeah, I think that's an apt comparison. It's kind of like we are taking out the green and the Char's Zaku 2 links that we typically see in 1 Year War. We're replacing with the Union Flag Custom link. Obviously, Union Flag Custom, just a little bit more detailed discussion about the card, is that it represents 2 shields on its attack, and they're high maneuver swings as well. So they get through the opponent's blockers just fine. And one thing that's also really, really important to highlight is that it represents a tempo swing that is very similar to Gundam RX-78, which is also in this deck. And so what you're really, really praying for in your hand, either post-mulligan or the first hand that you draw, is that you're going to get one of those links that you can play on curve on turn 4. Or even turn 3 if you go second, right? If you have either one of those, you're kind of set. They do slightly different things, but ultimately they're just going for that huge tempo swing that you can just start targeting shields from that point of the game on.
Yeah, so obviously it's very comparable to a Link to Char, but unlike either flavor of Char Zocker 2, which is effectively getting you another card, whether that be an actual other card or a token, this is more focused on just the sheer tempo advantage of bouncing one of your opponent's units back.
I guess when it comes to other card features, I think the cheap blockers are relatively interesting to mention because obviously these are cards that are seen most commonly in kind of like those go tall, big white sort of decks that we see in Gundam Card Game. However, sometimes I feel like it might be lost in the community that these cards are still cheap, resource efficient cards that can still turn themselves sideways in attacks so they don't have to block. So when you think about it, a Rick Diaz is just a Rezel with one less AP. So if you need to swing Rick Diaz at shield, or, you know, God forbid if we ever want to go for board in this deck, I guess we can, but not very often, it can also do that as well. So, you know, the blockers are there to be relatively multifaceted in this case, and it also makes your stocks go up against other aggro decks because you force them to make the bad trades against. I think the biggest last consideration here, and honestly a card that went so high up in our rankings, a card that we basically brushed off as kind of being unplayable at the start of making this video versus we think it might be, you know, within the top 15, top 20 cards of the set nowadays, is Awaken Potential. I wanted this card to be good. The art is really sick. It's Kieran the Seed. I love it. But it has Burst, add to hand. It's a level 4 1 cost. And then it has an action timing. You get to choose a rested enemy unit that is level 4 or lower, and then return it to the owner's hand. And then, of course, you have 2 or more Awaken Potentials in the trash. You may choose a friendly unit and give it blocker. I don't really consider that a line of text in this deck, but it is on the card.
It is amazing how much that just creates so many logistical issues because you have a scenario where Union Flag Custom comes down, gets linked, high maneuvers into you, bounces back one of your value pieces, and then next turn you link something to try to create that parity on the board again, and your opponent just looks at you and goes, no.
Yeah, and it's especially frustrating because this is a tempo deck at its core. Your ability to convert that tempo that you have with either the Union Flag Custom, which is probably the best thing to be protecting, but also RX-78 is equally as good, maybe slightly less good, I guess, to be completely fair. But you know, you just set up one of those early links that you have at level 4 and you kind of like protect the castle until the end of the game by using Awaken Potential to, you just kind of preserve that unit. You put it in, you know, MSG or whatever shelf stable ingredient you have. I might be losing some people with this one, but you kind of just like make sure it sits on the board for as long as you possibly can. And that's honestly Awaken Potential. Like a well-timed Awaken Potential is game winning, very backbreaking for the opponent in the best of, I guess, scenarios.
Absolutely. However, you know, as much as we're gassing this deck up, it does have some very obvious flaws.
Yeah, you are. When I said that you need to have a link on turn 4, I meant it. You need to see RX-78 and Amro on your turn that you get to link it, or a Union Flag Custom on the turn you get to link it. And the deck is not very forgiving if you don't get to see it because you're kind of playing a milquetoast below, I wouldn't say below rate, but there are other better aggro decks to be playing if you are not consistently seeing either of those 2 links. So I think that's kind of where the feast or famine part of this deck comes in. You're kind of at the mercy of Bandai's, you know, mulligan for Gundam, which is a fair mulligan, I suppose, but also not the most consistent thing in the world.
Doubly so since we aren't running any consistency pieces. This deck is just all gas, all units.
You better draw your cards. But outside of that, I'm looking forward to this deck. Probably one of the most confident I've been in a deck like this for one of these videos. And trust me, if you don't find success with this deck, I'll be on Twitter coping and posting, you know, maybe some progress of what my current version of Blue White's looking like. If it doesn't work out, maybe you can see me cope in real time, and that will also be a funny experience. But yeah, outside of that, I'm pretty confident in this deck. All right, Fulminatus, here's where we return, get a State of the Union address for what is actually happening with the Age archetype. We were very, very down on it in our previous video that we had for Dual Impact 3 months ago. And I just want, like, you know, a little progress report, a little status update about, you know, how Age is coming along. We talked about Age 2 normal early in this video, so I'm expecting to see that here. But yeah, what else is happening with Age as of 2026?
It is wild the difference 1 booster and like 3 cards can make for a deck. We have gone from Age Cope to this is a real deck. I don't know if this is a tier 1 meta contender, but this is a very real, very scary deck now.
At the very least, the deck may have evolved from age cope to age less cope, right?
I'll be completely honest, I don't even think the deck is cope right now. I think potentially the biggest issue you're going to run into is just not getting to what you need to fast enough, but at any point that the deck stabilizes, the deck just becomes very scary now. Turns out that adding a true top-end that isn't reliant on you not spending all your EX resources in Penelope has shored up a bunch of weaknesses that were otherwise found in the deck. But then we also got the absolute shield breaker that is G-Bouncer, which means that when you play that late age 1 that normally is just kind of a dinky little unit, well, it doesn't matter. He placed the EX resource, he has high maneuver now, he's killing a shield.
This is not the most big brain analysis here, but I feel like it has to be said. Previously in blue, in order to get mass quantities of card draw, we were kind of delegated to playing a playset of a Show of Resolve or any number of copies of a Show of Resolve. And sometimes you really just wonder, man, I wonder if I can get that card draw on a unit. And Penelope is here to kind of solve that problem for you, especially at a point in the game where you're going to be needing those extra cards if the game is still going.
The wildest thing is that early set 2 age builds were more focused on essentially playing a very slow ramp game, which wound up being problematic because age 1 wasn't a very good unit and required you to discard a card in order to get that resource. And then age device was another negative one to get that resource, so you wound up really cutting down your cards in hand early on in order to play more powerful units later, at which point, the green-white players were just laughing at you because they played a blocker every turn and we're still getting to wing 0, right? However, in this deck now, we basically cut all of that negative advantage. In fact, the largest reason that Age 1 is here is we're not using him as a ramp piece, we're using him as a later game source of putting down an EX resource. And it changed from this slow dirtle, I'm going to play these higher power units, to a more aggressive, I am trying to play an aggressive curve, link off with a high count of pilots, and then I'm going to recur the resources that were lost early later by just tucking back Earth Feds with Penelope, because funnily enough, while Age 1 cares that your Earth Feds are green, Penelope doesn't care. It just cares that it says Earth Federation at the bottom.
Yeah, and one thing that had me in stitches in the last video was your little write-up about the Age Cope deck. And one thing that always lives rent-free in my mind is the otherwise we were just abusing a smidgen of Earth-Fed synergy. I guess that still remains true. Some things never change, I guess, because we're still, using the Delta Plus to have a relatively versatile and generic link unit that kind of just goes with any of your pilots. And then obviously that kind of long-winded explanation we had of Penelope, and we were gassing up earlier. So yeah, still that smidgen of Earth-Fed synergy. Some things never change, Fulminatus.
Really want to emphasize lane giving high maneuver to any blue unit. Obviously, what we really want to put them on is Penelope, because lane on Penelope, you get Link, you get your draw, everything's a done deal. But even then, lane can go on a Delta Plus, and then you play an Age 1 at level 7 plus, so it gets you your card. Your Delta Plus is linked and has high.
Yeah, and then obviously not to mention the Age 1 Spallow. First Strike is still probably the best keyword in the game. It was one of basically the only reasons to want to play the deck in the old video. And of course we have more cards that have risen up the ranks this time to make Age more appealing as an archetype. But First Strike is still no joke.
Yeah, First Strike is absolutely no joke. The other dark horse of the deck, and it's really funny because if this goes where I think it's going to go, he's also going to wind up piloting the Dark Hound. But Asimu giving his linked unit Breach 1 just further folds into this actually really surprisingly aggressive strategy that the deck wants to play. Suddenly, all of your Asuno family trait age units, which is more than half of them, just wind up in a scenario where even if you aren't passing out high maneuver to them, if they crash into something else, they're still killing shields.
Yeah, for sure. Sometimes that little incidental bit of breach goes a very, very long way in furthering your game plan. All right, Fulminatus. We're glad that Age is back on the map, that you didn't have to suffer and, bang your head on the table for one more of these videos. But what does this deck actually lose to? What are we scared to be playing against?
So funnily enough, it's hard to really knuckle down on a particular direction that this deck loses in, because it's one of those decks that the threat it presents is across the board. But obviously we run into the whole deal of, if we're not hitting our pilots, if we're drawing our units in the wrong order, if the aggressive deck hits the nuts, you might be a little too slow to keep up. If you can't mount enough pressure into a control deck, they just start pushing you out of the game. So it's one of those decks that it kind of presents more neutral across the board. It isn't particularly weak to anything, but also it isn't that strong into anything in particular. However, that's not always a downside. It does mean that it can wind up being rather matchup agnostic. As long as you just control your resources and play really well, you can beat any deck.
For sure. And I think that that about sums up Age. Glad that it's no longer in the copium tier.
Probably the biggest low up of any deck I've seen in Gundam thus far.
Just wait until next set.
Speaking of glow ups, we have another deck that Reala has been tinkering with ever since set 1. He is committed to trying to make Justice Gundam work as a link unit, and so we're just going to read in really quick. I see in your notes here we have how does it win? Turn 2, play blocker. Turn 3, play blocker. Turn 4, play blocker or a card that kills blockers. Turn 5, play blocker. Turn 6, play 2 blockers. Turn 7, play America blocker. Turn 8, play Space Rock variant. Turn 9, oh god, the game is still going, play blockers and base. Turn 10, let this game in. Are you doing okay?
That depends on your definition of okay. Now, is this deck functional? Very much yes. Does this deck have good cards in it? Very much yes. Do I want to continue to be playing this deck going into the set 3 format? Very much no. And that's not because it's bad or anything, it's just because it plays like the slowest snail race that you've ever seen in Gundam Card Game. But yeah, that kind of distills it to, kind of the sauce about what this deck is doing. You play a bunch of blockers, you basically demand the opponent answer all of them to actually make any sort of meaningful progress throughout the game. And if you're able to kind of stall them to a halt, you get a really cool payoff and some of our very first LRs ever printed in the game, such as America Gundam, also known as Freedom, and Justice Gundam. So we have the Kira and Atherin, it's the seed deck. Still the direct upgrade pathway to if you find a Seed Strike starter deck still lying around, there's a lot of good cards from that starter deck that will make it into this deck. But outside of that, yeah, the deck's just kind of boring, man. That's the best way I can describe it.
That's the blue-white aggro player getting out.
Yeah, exactly. But, aside from that, you're just doing the thing. You're going up, you're playing your levels and resources. It's a very stable, boring curve. And then you get that massive payoff at the end. Our new Meteor cards are really, really interesting. So Justice Gundam Meteor presents several bounces. Freedom Gundam Meteor says, once returned during your turn, when your Triple Ship Alliance unit deals battle damage to an enemy unit, you may return an enemy unit to its owner's hand. So it really just plays into that Triple Ship Alliance synergy a little bit more. We don't have a whole lot of that synergy here because we kind of are just on the generic blocker plus other stuff, good stuffs package, but we have a little bit of Triple Ship Alliance synergy that I'll highlight here. So we have M1 Astray, which basically becomes a 3 AP, 2 HP blocker as long as you have another Triple Ship Alliance unit. So good to have some early game in this deck. Ailstrike Gundam is a decently statted blocker that also gives us a little bit of that filter, that draw one, pitch one, that we used to get from the starter deck Strike Gundam. So I'm glad that this is now in the deck and represents a blocker stat line to get that same ability. And this ability seems pretty innocuous at first. It seems pretty low action, low impact, but when you're playing a deck with as many high level cards as this one, because we see the 4 Freedom, 2 Justice, the Space Rocks, and even a base that's a higher level, honestly, getting that extra little bit of dig, that extra little bit of filter to prevent the brick scenario from your hand is going to do a lot more heavy lifting than you think it will.
Now, I will say, in testing, one thing that was surprising, it may not be the biggest reason to be on specifically Triple Ship Alliance as a deck, but the performance of Eternal has actually been pretty surprising.
Yeah, and a great segue there, because this is also additional Triple Ship Alliance support. But yes, does cost 2. We don't love 2-cost bases, generally speaking. Yes, it is level 5. What if you want to play a base early and you're getting your teeth kicked in by aggro? That's also another consideration. But at the end of the day, it's just like, it's basically an Ailstrike bounce, man. Like, it's hard to really complain about it.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to think about it. It's borderline an Ailstrike coming out of your base slot.
And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't really have it any other way. So it's funny that we now ask ourselves the question, what does this deck lose to? Because I think we just mentioned it. We just had the section on it. If the Graham Union's Flag custom is really coming at your shields and bouncing your early blockers, then honestly, we just got no shot. Like, we're out of the game before it even starts. And it's a little bit of a disheartening place to be in to begin. a deck, but obviously it may fare a little bit better into more traditional aggro shells that we've seen over the course of Gundam Card Game.
That is an unfortunate juxtaposition, is that we put blue-white aggro, which is very high maneuver focused, and then we put blue-green Earth Federation Age, which is also very high maneuver focused. So yeah, that's kind of what this deck loses to now.
The script is writing itself, Fulminatus. We got to a point where this channel's on autopilot. Anyway, so yeah, this is the last part of the script that we have here. How confident are you on the deck? And I just put a very, very, tongue-in-cheek answer of depends. How confident are you in blockers? It seems the community sentiment is pretty confident in blockers. That's been a very, potent, discussion of the previous meta. So we'll see if blockers still stand the test of time this meta. But if you like blockers, this is the deck for you. Alright, so we talked about Starter Deck 8, I think it was a couple weeks ago at this point on the channel, the Flash of Radiance deck based on Hathaway's Flash. Now this is the upgrade pathway for Hathaway. Let's talk about Blue-Red Ping in its new form.
I hate that pun. I hate that pun so much. But anyway.
Do the analysis, boy. Do the analysis.
Fine, I will dance. This is the classic BR Ping deck. If you've seen any kind of blue deck that also includes a Merida package, you are familiar with how this deck operates, except instead of having Merida, we have Hathaway and his Kasi Gundams and his Mafty Boys. Now, I say we have his Mafty Boys, it's Kasi Gundam and 2 other cards. But that genuinely does bring a lot to the table, as compared to previous blue-red Ping builds, which were highly reliant on their links to consistently get value. We're hitting Kshatriya to get value out of it. Merida herself has to be linked, and then ultimately culminating in the Moonshot with Unicorn Banshee Destroy just ending the game by reactivating and swinging twice. This trades all of that for what I actually think is a better Ping package. Our first Kasi Gundam just deals 1 damage for being played. That's tied to a 4/4 body. Then we have our Kasi Gundam Flight form, which deals 1 damage to everything for being linked. Kshatriya was dealing 3 damage before. This is still dealing 3 damage, but potentially more, because if their board's even wider, you get more out of it. Combine that with how Hathaway works and the fact that he allows a Mafty unit to swing at a damaged unit, you wind up taking more valuable trades, and I ultimately think that this is just the natural progression. But the card I want to bring everyone's attention to, because this is a card that I genuinely think is being severely undervalued, is LR Kasi Gundam. This is a card that very specific decks want and is used in very specific scenarios, but in those scenarios, this card is actually nuts, because this is a card that you can go into a board where your opponent has developed 3 units. It's a very common scenario where they will trade off into your board. They'll have 2 to 3 units left, and they'll pass the turn back to you at about level 4, level 5, and so on. That you can just drop a linked 5/5 that immediately pings off their strongest thing for 3, at which point they now have this big tank that they have to contest. It is a tempo swing on par with hitting the RX-78 Amuro on turn 4.
For sure, and it's one of those cards that if the opponent is not actively playing around it, which at this point in the metagame as it's progressing and we're seeing the community sentiment on the card where it seems like it's not going to be played that much, you can definitely just make mistakes into this deck and not think that they're playing it and call your shot incorrectly and get punished so hard for it.
That is honestly the best way to think about this card. It is a card that is very punishing if your opponent isn't playing around it, and because people don't want to play it, people will not be playing around it. Beyond that, it's just the classic pile of we're packing as much ping together as we can. This is probably the deck that you are the most likely to get your Alex draw off of, because you're going to ping something down, play the Alex last, ping the rested thing, kill it, get your card back. That is always a great trade. But another card that I really want to call attention to, because I think it does a ton of this deck, it doesn't immediately read crazy, is the Messer type FO1, our level 2 cost 2/1. 1 HP is scary, especially against a deck like the one it's in. However, being able to ping for 1 on its attack this early and this small is extremely relevant. It winds up working similar to a Strike Dagger clone, where this is a card that immediately threatens things like Rick Dias, it threatens Rizels, it threatens Ankhshas, and being able to do that on your turn 2 is a tool that a lot of decks really just aren't prepared to deal with. I mean, even the strongest turn 2 board usually you would consider to be, what, two 1/2/2s played simultaneously? Well, if you played your type FO1, that immediately contests that board because you trade into 1/2/1/2/2, and then you ping the other one for half its health off of one card.
You know, I have this brainworm about this deck and just blue-red ping in general. I think that this just kind of distills it into like such an important sentence, right? But this is just algebra of the deck. You take a look at the remaining HP of a card on the opponent's board, you make that X, you figure out what permutation of pings you need to order to reach that value of X, right? And it's really just one of those decks that's more about the journey than the destination, of just like figuring out those little just interactions throughout the course of a game that will actually bring you the most value. And so I think this deck, more so less from like the analysis perspective, but more so just like how it feels to play perspective, I think those players that are very methodical and meticulous will really get a whole lot of kicks out of this deck, and honestly have been for blue-red ping for, the 2 sets that we've had it for in Gundam Card Game.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to put it. This is a deck that rewards you for planning out your resources and just creating scenarios where you have essentially dedicated resources to developing bodies, but because they have these pings attached to them, you have essentially started clearing out your opponent's value, and they still have to contest the actual bodies sitting on your board.
Yeah, and like you kind of highlighted earlier, it's one of those decks that's really, really fun to play because it's not really a deck that is kind of in the forefront of people's minds. I think a lot of people just kind of wrote off Hathaway at the start of the when the starter deck came out. But of course, I'm looking forward to seeing how the sentiment evolves and if this deck can actually claim a spot. How are you feeling in terms of confidence levels?
My confidence level in this deck as is actually pretty high, largely just because it's not a deck that people are really gearing to play against. And so it's kind of, we talked about this with the Shenlong deck, but the idea of playing a deck that's hating on what other people are currently doing is really strong as long as people are doing that thing. So if people aren't prepared to play against this deck, it's going to do well. If people are prepared to play against this deck, it's not going to do as well. But the exchange of that is, if they're prepared to play against this deck, they're potentially taking paths and plays that are making them worse into their other matchups, right?
All right, that's about it for this deck list video. As always on the channel, thanks so much for watching these. These, take a lot of effort and hours put into the video to kind of make it. So of course, thanks for making it all the way to the end. It means a lot to us here on Side 9. Please keep on the lookout for future videos that we have planned for metagame coverage and things of that nature for GDO3 and future boosters as well. Any other final words that you kind of want to talk about before we kind of bid our farewells in this video form?
Nothing much other than I'm just super excited for this format. GDO3 is an absolutely sick set. We were big on GDO2. It seems like the community was pretty down on GDO2. I still think everybody's coping thinking GDO2 is a bad set, and it's gonna age like fine wine. But I think we're all in agreement that GDO3 is a much more exciting set.
Yeah, definitely my favorite set this game has come out with, I think. And I'm glad the sentiment is high overall, just in terms of this release as well.
Agreed. And I think with all that, Reala and I will see you guys next mission.